Hello, this is Andrew Hall. Today we're holding the class Integrated Sciences for Global Society. This is number 13, Japan as a part of modern East Asia, on November 25th. Now, it's very noisy here, unfortunately. I'm at my home, and turns out there's some construction going on here. So I'm sorry about that, and hopefully it won't bother you too much. All right, so let me get my material here. Share screen, here we go. All right. Okay, so today we're going to talk about empire and colonialism. So let me just briefly introduce myself. So my name is Andrew Hall. I come from the United States. I was originally born in Los Angeles and lived in that area through high school. I went to college in Utah in the West called Brigham Young University. I first came to Japan in 1988 when I was 19 years old, and I liked it and I wanted to keep coming back. So when I went back to college in Utah, I started studying Japanese history. And then I transferred to the University of Pittsburgh and finished my undergraduate there and did my master's and doctorate. And while I was there, I also came back to Japan. I spent 95 to 97 in Kyushu at Kyushu University here in Fukuoka as a Kenkyusei student. And then I came back again in 1999 to do my doctoral research in Tokyo. And I came back again in 2001 to finish writing my dissertation, living in Fukuoka again. And then I got a job after I got my PhD. I got a job in Texas and lived there for 7 years, teaching at the University of North Texas. And then I was hired here at Kyushu University and have been here since 2010. So which is 15 years total that I've lived in Japan. And my study, I particularly look at areas in East Asia that Japan colonized, like Manchuria or Manchukuo, that was colonized in 1932. Invaded in 1931 and made into a puppet state in 1932. And I look at the education that the Japanese did in these states, in these territories. You know, how much Japanese language they taught, what they expected these regions to become. And so I look at what kind of schools they built. I also look at colonial Korea and compare what's going on in Manchuria to Korea and to Okinawa and to Taiwan. First of all, history. We're going to talk about history. Why are you studying history? What's the value of it? Oh, it's being very loud right now. I think one of the key things is that it provides education and intelligence. And this is kind of, for tests, for the sake of tests, which kind of encourages mindless memorization, in schools. It's a hurdle, a way to get people to figure out, what college you can go to. And so they have to put up various hurdles, and this is one of the hurdles. So it's not, this tends to be not kind of history that really sticks with you very much. But it also helps us understand other peoples and societies, places that we don't live, people that we don't know, but try to figure out why they do what they do. Great people, how do they become great? How do they become geniuses? How do certain societies succeed? A lot of people are interested in that. How do societies work and succeed? And hopefully to help you understand your own life by looking at others' lives. I also think it can contribute to a moral understanding. Look at choices that people have made in the past and try to figure out how, how their choices were succeeded or failed. And, the morality of them. It gives us a chance to stand in other people's shoes, to recognize others' experiences and worldviews are different from our own, and understands other people's experiences and emotions. And I think, we skipped a number here, 3 to 5, but it provides identity. National identity, or perhaps regional or religious identity, depending on what kind of school you go to. But, for example, if it's national identity, how to be a good citizen, understand how your national institutions came to be and how they've worked. So today we're going to look at imperialism and colonies, especially in East Asia, but really all over the world. And we're going to talk about, what makes a colony. Is Okinawa, which is today an integrated part of Japan, was that a colony? Is it a colony still? How about Korea, when Japan ran Korea? Was that a colony? Has your country ever experienced colonialism or had any kind of colonies? Colonialism is a term that can refer to any kind of unequal relationship between a powerful and the oppressed. This could be a political colony, racial discrimination, class discrimination, gender discrimination, lots of different kinds of unequal relationship between powerful and oppressed can be called colonization. I mean, usually you think of colonies, you think of an actual physical colony like British controlling India. But today, the word colonization is used for this much more broader kind of things. And getting away from that, moving away from these kind of unequal relationships is often called decolonization. Now, the fight against colonization is not over. You might say, oh, the days of colonies are over. But if you look at colonization in this larger context of any kind of oppression of a weaker people, for instance, currently in the United States and in other countries, there's this Black Lives Matter movement, which is saying there's still inequality, there's still oppression that needs to be recognized. And this has been a huge deal in the United States. People saying, oh, I hadn't really thought of that as oppression. But maybe that is something we should still think about. This is in England, actually, in Bristol, in the United Kingdom, also this year. This is a group, a mob, one might say, tearing down a statue of a very leading person in the Bristol society back 200 years ago, but he was a slave merchant. He helped make the city rich, and so there's lots of places named after him and a big statue to him, but he bought and sold slaves, Black African slaves. And people in the community decided, we don't want him as a hero anymore. And they took action by tearing him down, tearing the statue of him down. Tearing it on the ground, kneel on him, and eventually dumping him into the river. So that now the statue is at the bottom of the river in Bristol. And around the same time, we had similar movements against Confederate monuments in the United States. In the southern part of the United States, there's lots of monuments to people who fought in the Civil War on the side of the South, the side that supported slavery. And people said, well, maybe that wasn't good what they did, but they were heroes. They sacrificed themselves, and we should make a statue of them. And a lot of people now are starting to say, no, let's not consider them heroes. Let's tear these statues down. So colonies. And so I'm going to specifically now look at actual territory that's been taken over by one country. When did colonialism happen? And what kinds of colonialism are there? And I'm going to talk about three kinds of colonialism: internal colonialism, peripheral colonialism, and overseas colonialism. And out of the three, overseas colonialism is probably what you think of usually as colonialism. But I'm going to talk about how these other kinds of colonialism are also colonialism as well. I'm just going to check here and make sure that we're still recording. We are. Good. Okay, so go back to that. Powerful. Okay. Now, we have to be careful when we look at this kind of history that we avoid presentism. That is, judging the past by today's values. And also, right? I mean, we can use today's values, certainly, but we have to be aware that past societies don't necessarily have those same values. Also, maybe even more important, we have to be careful not to think of today's borders of today's countries as eternal borders that have always existed. They haven't. They're created things, often, in the last centuries or decades or years. They're not eternal things. So, for instance, if you look at a map of Russia or China or of India, or of any country really, for many years, these places were not controlled by, say, the government in Moscow or the government in Leningrad. Chunks of this area were independent. Chunks of China, chunks of Japan. These when you talk about Chinese history, you have to be aware that there is histories, local histories within China that did not consider themselves part of China for a long time. So we have to be careful about not looking at history as in the past in its own terms and not on today's terms. So what kind of colonialism had there been? When did it happen? Well, there's lots of examples we can make. We can look at the colonization of the Americas after Columbus goes to America in 1492. And Spain, Portugal, England, and France, and the Dutch take over parts of the Americas. That's certainly a kind of colonialism, right? How about the British taking over India? Sure, that's a kind of colonialism. How about the United States moving toward the West and taking over parts of Western United States? And also the unequal treatment of Native Americans and Africans. Should that be part of colonialism? And now you might be surprised because you might say, oh, well, today you think of the whole United States, so that's not colonization, that's just expansion. But I would say, no, that's a kind of colonialism. We can put that within colonialism. Now, it's colonialism that worked. There's nobody in the Western United States who says, I want to be an independent country. But still, just because that's how we think today doesn't mean that's how they thought in an earlier period. The formation of Great Britain, where these four parts. There's England, but there's also Wales and Scotland and Ireland that were for many, many centuries separate societies, separate countries. And eventually they get brought together into this United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Well, so again, we have to kind of think of these places as having separate histories, connected but separate. How about the formation of China from ancient times? I mean, different Chinese dynasties at different times controlled different areas in China, and grew and shrank at different times. And most recently is the conquering from the Qing period of the Western territories of Xinjiang and Tibet. Should we talk about that as colonies? All right, so there's these three kinds I mentioned: internal colonialism, peripheral colonialism, and overseas colonialism. So let's first internal colonialism. Let's look at the example of France. Now, when was France created? Well, there was various kingdoms centered around the kind of Paris area, going way back. Soon, not long after the fall of the Roman Empire, you have these various kingdoms that were there that eventually developed into France. And by the time you get to say, the 13th century, the size of France is kind of generally what you would expect it to be today. However, within France, there was lots of different languages, and the people inside did not all necessarily consider themselves French. For example, in the South, lots of people spoke this language, Occitan, that was very different from Paris-style French, virtually incomprehensible. They were totally different languages, and people from the North and people from the South couldn't understand each other. Provençal language. The Breton language is totally different. It's a different language family completely. It's a Celtic language, unlike the Romantic or Roman style language of French. So there's these various peoples that speak different languages, and the people within the country did not all consider themselves French. They considered themselves part of this territory or that territory, right? Now, after the French Revolution in the 18th century, the government of France started saying to themselves, we need to have everybody thinking themselves as French. In order for us to win our battles, for our army to be strong, for our country to be strong, people need to think of themselves as French. And so they started doing national education. They started doing national education, and including that national education was language policy, trying to get everyone to speak Paris-style national French. I mean, there was no national French before, right? There's just all these different kinds of languages, dialects that people spoke. One wasn't more French than the other. But, if the power holders are in Paris, and that they determine that to be the main French language, then they start teaching that all over the country. And work very hard in the schools to teach patriotism and a sense of Frenchness, that you're not just from Provence, you're not just from Breton, you are French. And it was, it took a while. It took, throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, it really took about 100 years of effort to get people in all these different regions to think of themselves as French. And really schools, but also through the draft, bringing young men together from different regions and having them have to work together. And these things were all part of creating the sense of French identity. And this is what we call internal colonialism. Again, let's look at China. China has got lots of different languages. Again, not mutually comprehensible to each other. And just, pre-modern times, people in different regions, if you ask them, are you Chinese? Most people would say, first of all, they didn't have the word Zhongguo, really. Very few people use that. They might say, oh yes, I'm under the Ming dynasty. I'm under the Ming Emperor, the Qing Empire. But, probably they'd just say, no, I'm from this region. I'm from the Hunan region, or I'm from this village, or I'm from this family. Usually their identities were more family-based or regional-based. And so it's really in the 20th century, this effort to, create a sense of Chinese national identity and picking one of the language groups, Beijing Chinese, to be the standard language, the Putonghua, the Hiujungo, the standard language of the whole country, and teaching that in schools all over the place, and teaching the people in the schools, you are Chinese. You need to think of yourself as Chinese. Again, a gradual process, internal colonialism. All right, so here's the second one, peripheral colonialism. Peripheral colonialism means you have a strong state, and then there's weaker areas nearby the strong state, which the strong state takes over and incorporates into its country, gradually and it could be, it can keep going for a while, spreading out farther and farther. And some of these have become big states. But anyways, it's taking over territories that are on your border and that you have a certain degree of control, not complete control over, but over time you're able to get complete control over. Now, American expansion to the West in the 19th century is a very good example of this. The United States, the government of the United States, these white settlers from Europe who create this independent country in 1776 and defeat the British. And then you have these territories that are kind of controlled by the French and Spanish and different groups, but not very strongly controlled by them, and populated by Native American peoples. And gradually America just makes claim, buys some of these territories from the French, or wins territories in a war against Spain, in the case of Texas, or just gradually takes over these places and incorporates the people there, including the Native American peoples that live there. Now, so Americans usually don't think of this as colonialism, but certainly this is a form of colonialism. We're going in using force, using violence to take over places that you didn't control before. And eventually this goes to, Alaska and Hawaii, which are kind of more overseas colonialism, but very, very different peoples. And as part of this, the United States did a lot of assimilation policies. The Native American peoples in these areas and other minority groups that came into these areas, including Black people, African Americans. There's assimilation policies to try to get them to think of themselves as Americans. And then, so Hawaii and Alaska, which are very separated and have very different peoples. As Hawaii has the Hawaiian nationality, the Hawaiian ethnic group is very different from the European-dominated population of the United States. And yet it is taken over by the United States over the course of the 1870s, 1880s. There's a king there. It was a separate kingdom, but that king is overthrown basically by the American military and becomes an American territory. But then by 1950, Alaska, 1950s, mid-50s, Alaska and Hawaii become states, not just territories, not just colonies, but full states of the United States with all the rights that are part of that. So today, Hawaiians and Alaskans are 100% American citizens. They have all the rights of American citizenship. And again, there's very few people in those territories who would say, I want to be independent. I want to have an independent Hawaii. I mean, there's some, but very, very few. So you can say this is a case of successful colonization. What had become a colony was integrated into the state. And you could think of someone from that state becoming president. No, in fact, Hawaii is the home state of President Obama. I mean, he lived in a few different places, but one of the places he lived as a child was Hawaii. He claims Hawaii as his home state. So, he's not Native Hawaiian, but he's African-American, at least in part African-American, and he, completely identifies himself as American. And, a Native Hawaiian could certainly become president of the United States. Russia has another kind of similar to the United States, peripheral, this time going the other direction, going from the west to the east, gradually going from a territory rather small, pretty big, but this limited territory in the 1500s and taking over areas to the south and then to the east, little by little until 1894, they finally taken over all of these territories, what's considered now Russian. And again, the peoples in these territories were not Russian, right? They didn't speak the Russian language. They were different ethnic groups, but they are assimilated into that government. England and Wales and Ireland and Scotland. Again, these are places that were independent countries. They had their own kings, their own places. But gradually, through military and economic power, England was able to take over Wales and Scotland in the Middle Ages, and Ireland in the early modern era. And teach English language. And at first there's inequality between these places, but eventually, Wales has had prime ministers. Lloyd George was from Wales. Scotland had a man who was the prime minister of all of Great Britain a few years ago. His name escapes me for a minute. But you can have people from these places become head of your country, and they're considered completely part of the state. Although in this case, of course, Ireland fought against it. And that's partly because Ireland was Catholic, and Catholics were not treated equal. For a long time, Catholics were not allowed to enter the top universities. They were treated unequally. And because of that inequality, they eventually pushed for independence. Okay. So we mentioned the Uyghurs, the Xinjiang area in northwestern China, which is populated by Muslim ethnic group, um, and they are yeah, and they had their own independent kingdoms for a long time. But during the Qing period in 1755 or so, they get taken over by the Qing dynasty, which is located in Beijing. And Tibet as well. It had been an independent kingdom with its own language, its own culture, and it gets taken over, in the 1780s and is gradually integrated into the Qing. Now they lose both these territories during the whole period of war and civil war in the early 20th century when China kind of falls apart for a while. But then once it's reunited under the communist government in 1949, and very quickly they move to reincorporate these areas. So in 1949, the Uyghurs, in 1950, they invade Tibet, and they reincorporate these areas into the country. So is that colonialism? Is that, it's peripheral, it's a territory right next to them, and that they had control for many centuries, since 1755, since 1792. So there's a long history of control in these places. It's not a new colony, but, again, is there a date when colonialism should start? Say, oh, a colony is only a colony if it happened in the last 50 years, last 100 years. That's a good question. Okay, so now the third group is called overseas colonialism. Now this is one that I think we can all agree, oh yeah, that's colonialism. For example, the colonialism of the America, where in 1492, Europeans, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the French, the English, here's the French up here, here's the English over here, even the Russians over here, are taking over chunks of the Americas and often sending in their own populations as immigrants to live there. Also transporting large numbers of African slaves to be laborers in these places. Now, of course, there are native peoples in the Americas, lots of them, lots of Native Americans, but they were relatively weak. Their technology was relatively not very highly developed. In some ways, they're very smart, developed in some ways, but they just didn't have, for instance, the metals that were available to peoples in Europe and Asia and Africa. They didn't have the animals, very few large animals that they could use to help them in farming, like people had in the other hemisphere. And those things really helped to weaken these people. So when the Europeans came in, they were able to defeat them very quickly. And then most of all, they were not used to the diseases that people from Europe and Africa had. Partly because Europe and Africa, again, have these big animals that help them, the horse, the cow, the ox, the pigs, and all these large animals that they work with, and they've gotten diseases from, and they've gotten used to those diseases over the centuries. In America, the only large animal that they're able to use is really the llama, and then its close cousin, the alpaca, which actually you can't use them to pull a plow. You can use them for milk and for fur and for meat, but you can't use them to really do work around the farm. They won't do it. And so because they don't have this history of large animal husbandry, you don't have a lot of the diseases that they've gotten used to in Europe and Asia. So now these Europeans come over and they bring over all these diseases that the Americans are not used to, and they die in huge numbers. There's some estimates that say 80% of Native Americans died within 100 years. So by 1492, 1500s when the Europeans first arrived, by 1600, 80% of the population had died, not through war, but through disease. And so some of these Europeans came over and they're like, there's nobody here. Look at all this open space. We could just come in and bring all these immigrants into here. And they could do that because there just wasn't very many Americans there to fight them, because so many of them had died from disease. Now, that's not true in Africa, because Africa had a long history of connection with Europe. The diseases had gone back and forth, Europe and Asia and Africa. So they're used to all those diseases. In fact, there's diseases in Central Africa that the Europeans were not used to. And as Europeans tried to go in, they would die of sickness. So you had these very powerful kingdoms in Africa for many centuries. They were able to fight off the Europeans. The Europeans are having their boats coming around Africa and going into Asia, and they're able to set up little ports in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. But they're not able to come in and take over big sections of Africa because African kings are too strong. But in the 19th century, Europe had gone through the Industrial Revolution, and now suddenly they're much more powerful than they had been before. In 1700, Europe could not take over Africa. They couldn't take over India or China or places like that. The only little coastal ports is all they could get. But in the 1800s, the 19th century, that's when the kind of guns and technology, including medicine, so they could, handle these sicknesses, and eventually, large-scale military vehicles, and they could use those to take over these places in Africa. So that in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s especially, that's when the French and the British and the Belgians and these other groups took over big swaths of Africa. So that's certainly an overseas colony that happens in the late 19th century. Similarly, India, again, before, say, 1790, 1757, 1770s, 1780s, there's a little bit, but again, it's just a little bit on the edges. It's really once you get into the 1790s, 1800s, that's when the British are able to really take over the former empire of the Mughals and make it a British colony. And that remains a British colony until 1947, one of the more profitable colonies, because India is a very profitable place, a very productive country. So here's my three kinds of colonialism: internal, peripheral, and overseas. When did it happen? Well, you can go way back. You can say colonialism, you can look at instances of colonialism way back in ancient times. So there's all kinds of different ones. And it's still happening now, right? There's still places where you can say, is this colonialism? And so, these places are like, well, that's not colonialism. Like Scotland, is that colonialism? Southern France, Xinjiang in China, is that colonialism? No, because that's part of the country, one might say. So usually I think the normal perspective from today is that if it's part of the country now, if it's incorporated into a country now, like Xinjiang is part of China, then that's not a colony. Maybe it was once, but it's not anymore. But if a state achieved liberation, like India, then sure, that was a colony. They tried to maybe integrate it into Great Britain, but they failed, and it became an independent state. So we're judging it by what happens today. But again, I told you, you shouldn't judge things in history by what's true today. What about, again, this is happening now. Russia in 2014 just waltzed in. I mean, there's this independent country called Ukraine next to it, but it's a weaker country. And Crimea is a very valuable area with valuable ports and naval ports for the Russians. And they decide they want that. And in 2014, they just come in. They just invade and they take it. And the rest of the world protests and says you shouldn't do that. But nobody decides they have enough power to really fight the Russians on this thing. So in 2014, the Russians colonized a part of another country. So how do you judge these conquests? Which ones are legitimate and which ones are not? Can we even say, what makes it legitimate? And, so different people have different kinds of ways of defining it. And I'm not saying any of these are right, but this is things that people use. For instance, did it work? Was it successful? Is this area now part of the country that, undisputably? Do the locals accept it? Do they say, yes, I'm part of this country. I'm happy to be part of this country. Are they treated equally? I didn't write this down, but, are they treated equally? Can you expect somebody from that area to become president or prime minister or head of the country? Is there any discrimination of the people in that area? Also, you can say, does this area have a long historical connection with the central part of the government? Is it geographically close? Some people might say that. When did it happen? Did it happen a long time ago? Well, then we shouldn't count that, some might say. Like Russia taking over, an area very close to it. That happened so long ago, you can't call that a colony, one might say. Was this gradual state formation that happened long ago, or was this more recent overseas colonialism? So these are the kind of questions that someone might ask. Let's look at the case of Japan. So Japan has had all of these. They've had internal, peripheral, and overseas colonialism, examples of all these. And here I'm going to look at these different examples, from the expansion of the Yamato state in the ancient period to the invasion of China and Southeast Asia in the 1930s and 40s. So first of all, you can say, well, the Yamato state, which is centered around the Yamato area around Osaka, Nara, Kyoto area, gradually over the course of the Kofun, Nara, Heian periods, took over what's now Kyushu. These different people, these tribal Kumaso people lived in Kyushu, and they were not ruled by the Yamato court. But, gradually they get taken over. In the north, the Emishi people, northeast, Honshu and up to Hokkaido, gradually over the course of this period, they're incorporating these areas into Japan. And that's, you could call that, I guess, peripheral colonialism in this case. But, even though they're part of Japan, in actuality, through a lot of Japanese history, there's a lot of regional power. So there may be a shogun or an emperor who's supposedly in charge of the whole country, but he's not that strong. And you have these local lords that are really running things in their own areas. For example, in the Edo period. Japan is divided up into all these different lords. And there's a shogun who's supposedly in charge, and he has a lot of power, but he lets these local people run themselves. So the people in these different areas, they see themselves as not Japanese. A lot of them don't. They see themselves as, well, I'm a Hiroshima person. I'm a an Oita person, or whatever it is. And they didn't say Oita back then, because that wasn't the name of the place. But whatever the names of these countries were, then Chikuzen or Chikugo, Hizen, say, I'm from this domain, or I'm just, again, from this clan, or I'm from this religion. And there's a real attempt in the Meiji period from the 1870s to change this local identity to a national identity. They saw how France and Germany, the United States had this strong national identity, and they wanted to have that as well. And so they eliminate these local domains and turn them into prefectures that are run by the central government. And they do these various efforts to try to create national identity. For instance, the national language movement. They pick one dialect. And again, just like France and all these other places, very different dialects. People in Kagoshima have a very distinct dialect that's really not comprehensible to somebody from Edo. If they don't, if these people only speak the Kagoshima dialect and they go to Edo and try to talk to someone, they're going to have a very, very hard time. But so there's this attempt to create a national language, and in school, and there's compulsory education for elementary schools. Everyone needs to go to at least 4 years of elementary school, all boys and girls, and then they increase it to 6 years. Everyone needs to go to this school and learn the standard language. And they pick the Tokyo language, the Edo language, as the national language. That had not been the national language before, right? In fact, Kyoto had maybe a more high status language than Edo, but Edo is the dominant area economically and politically, and becomes the capital of Japan, and so they picked that as the national language. Also, military conscription, again, just like France. Bringing these people from different areas together, and we want them to be able to speak to each other. We want them to have the sense of national identity. And another big thing is that they use, they really push nationalism and belief in your country in the schools, and the emperor is the symbol of all this. Hold on a second. Okay, start it up again here. Now, so that was, I would call that internal colonialism. Now, how about peripheral colonialism? So early on in the Meiji period, there's an attempt to have these various islands that are nearby, and it's kind of vague exactly, who runs these things, to make claims over these various islands and say, this is us, and this is what our territory is. Now, there's a neighboring country called the Ryukyu Kingdom. And these islands that are kind of halfway between Kyushu and Taiwan, the largest one called Okinawa, and these several islands together were part of an independent kingdom called the Ryukyu Kingdom. Japan, any kind of, the Japanese emperors, Japanese shoguns, had never ruled the Ryukyu Kingdom. It had always been independent. And it's a big trading kingdom. It's not, they don't have a lot of land, but they did a good job trading between Japan and China and Southeast Asia, bringing different goods back and forth. We're able to have a certain degree of wealth through that. When the Westerners came in the in the late 1500s and 1600s, they took away a lot of that trade. They took over a lot of that trade, and that hurt the Ryukyu Kingdom. And in 1605, Satsuma, which is a domain in southern Kyushu around Kagoshima, invades Ryukyu Kingdom and successfully takes it over. They don't make it a colony officially. Well, they colonize it, but they don't make it an official colony. It remains an independent country because Satsuma wants them, the Ryukyu has this trading deal, has a relationship with the Qing government in China, which Japan doesn't have. Japan doesn't have a direct relationship with China. It would like to trade with them, but it's difficult. There is some trade through Nagasaki, but it's limited. So trade through Ryukyu Kingdom would be good. So Satsuma does not officially take over Ryukyu Kingdom. Instead, it just stays in the background and runs things from the shadows. and tries to make money through the trade that Ryukyu does with China, as well as getting the sugar that the Ryukyu has. So they unofficially control the Ryukyus after 1605, but it's still officially an independent country. But in 1872, now that the Japanese government has been set up, the Meiji government, the Satsuma domain no longer exists. It's been taken over by the central government, and they decide to formalize this control over the Ryukyus by annexing it into Japanese control. Here's a picture of Shuri Castle. Shuri Castle was the capital of Okinawa, the Ryukyu kingdom. This is where the king ruled from. It burned down. This is not the original. It burned down in World War II, and in the fighting in World War II when Americans invaded Okinawa. And it was rebuilt in the early 1990s. I lived in Okinawa in 1989, 1990. It wasn't there yet. But then soon after I left, they rebuilt it. And it's this beautiful place. Did a great job of rebuilding it. Very different from, the kind of castles and palaces you have in Japan. Very much more like a Chinese castle. Unfortunately, it burned down again last year, and then an accidental fire happened, and it burned the whole thing down. And it was very, very sad. It's this great treasure of Okinawa. So currently, they're trying to rebuild it. Let's get through it. So that was part of like controlling these islands. A big part of it was making this claim over Okinawa and annexing it in 1872. And then once they do that, then after that, there is taking over of territories that were clearly controlled by, independent countries with no relation to Japan previously, like Korea in 1905, 1910, Taiwan taken from China in 1895, and other territories as well. That's clearly overseas colonies. Let's talk about Korea a little bit. So Taiwan and Korea are these two territories that were taken over by Japan, 1895, 1905. And Okinawa, there is a long-standing connection, even though it's an independent country. You look at, let me see, a better map here. So here's Okinawa here, and here's Kyushu. There's actually, you can't see them all here, but there's a string of islands going from Ryukyu to Kyushu. And it's very easy for, pre-modern sailors to go back and forth. So there's always been a lot of trade between Kyushu and Ryukyu, a lot of connection. And clearly the Ryukyu people, and archaeology shows, the ancient Ryukyu people were connected to the Japanese people. There's clearly people going back and forth. And the languages are clearly connected. They're cousin languages. Today they're not mutually comprehensible. Again, the Ryukyu language is totally different. But there's clearly there's grammar similarities between them. It's totally different from the Chinese language. There's no, they're completely different languages. And this is a lot harder to go back and forth. So in ancient times, there wasn't much back and forth between China, but there was a lot of back and forth between Japan. So Ryukyu is ethnically and linguistically related to Japan. And so Japan taking it over, if you want to say, this is something based on, ethnic reasons, then you can say that. Hold on. Okay. Oh. Okay. Sorry, let me start this again. Okay, sorry. All right. Took a little pause there. It was very loud with the construction. All right. And let's just talk a little bit about, so if Okinawa has a long history of connection with Japan, Korea and Taiwan don't, right? These are very different cultures, very different languages, very different histories. And there's, again, no history of Japan controlling these places in the past. These were just places that were conquered through war. And let me just tell you a little story here about this area here. This is a palace of the Korean kingdom. Has been rebuilt in recent years, but this is the site of this ancient Korean palace in Seoul, Korea. And it's built in a very important place, just kind of at the foot of this mountain. And the Koreans very much believed in this idea, from China of feng shui or fu sui, this idea of the wind and the water, and you put things based on this kind of natural, where it's naturally going to have the most power and most protected, based on the mountains and the rivers and the other topography around it. And this is definitely one of those places. It's placed in this place of great power. It's a beautiful place, very much based on the Chinese capital in Beijing. There's this gate out in front of it, and traditionally, this gate, the king was the only person who can go through the middle gate. And then one of the gates is for his military advisors, and the other gate is for his civilian advisors. So there's this is all people saw. People didn't see, common people never went into the actual insides of it. They just saw this outer gate. Now, Japan, when they take it over in 1910, they decide they want to create a Capitol building for themselves, very modern, to show themselves off as this modern imperialistic country. And where do they want to build it? They decide they want to build it on the site of this Korean palace. That's the site of their power. Here's a picture of this palace in ancient times, or not ancient, but pre-modern. And here's this gate. It's the only thing they saw outside of it. The regular people would see. So the Japanese decide to move this gate and tear down a big chunk of the palace, not all of it, but a huge chunk of it. And in its place, plop down this big modern building. Kind of in front of it, there's this main street that goes in front of it. And instead of seeing the palace of the king, or the no longer king there, instead have this modern building that represents Japan right in the front. Now, this made a lot of Koreans mad. The fact that basically their palace was being erased, and this Japanese symbol was put out in front. But that's what the Japanese did. Here you can see. So here's this major boulevard. Today, this is this major street in Seoul. This is where all these key government buildings are, and the City Hall, and the American Embassy, and all these big buildings are here. And it kind of ends at where this palace was. But here in the colonial period, it ends at this colonial building. That's very much the symbol of the Japanese. Here you can see again, from the front. There's the palace behind it. This gate, they wanted to destroy the gate, but a lot of people said, no, you can't destroy this gate. This is so beloved. And there were some Japanese ethnologists who said, oh, this is a important monument, you should destroy it. So instead they moved it to a different area. Here they moved it, you can see in 1926. They moved it kind of to the side, so it no longer wasn't in front anymore. Now in 1945, Japan lost the war, and America came in and liberated the South, and of course the Russians controlled the north of Korea, so it was split into two countries. But this building that was the headquarters for the Japanese becomes the headquarters for the American military. And then when the South Koreans declared the Republic of Korea in 1948, they do it from this building. Okay, sorry, let me start again. So, so you think maybe the Koreans might say, let's get rid of this building. This is the symbol of Japan. But, it's a big, beautiful building, and Korea's, been very much racked by war, and they don't have a lot of great buildings, and this is a very useful building, so they use it. It becomes the home of the National Assembly of South Korea. It's, the parliament building for several years. Then, it's a government building until 1982. Then it becomes a museum for several years until 1995. Then 1995, here it is in its time as a museum. Big, again, very impressive building, lots of marble. So, why tear down a building like that? Now, but still, it's a symbol of Japan. And a lot of people are like, they don't like that very much. We'll talk about all the reasons why colonialism was difficult for Korea. But in 1968, they decided to rebuild this gate. That's again the symbol. This is what people are used to when they think of their history. And they rebuilt it in front of this building. So the building's still there, but it's behind this gate. Here you can see again. Here's this important street with all this, the Seoul City Hall and all these important buildings on it, leading up to. Here's the gate, and then here's the old colonial building, and then behind it there's some buildings of the old palace as well. But in the 1990s is when they became a democratic government again, and they were starting to listen more to the voice of the people. And the voice of people said, "We don't like this building. We don't like that this is a symbol of Japan." So in the early 90s, they had a vote about whether they should tear it down or not, and the people said, "Yes, tear it down." So in 1996, they tore it down. And they ripped it down, and here you can see before they ripped it down what it looked like, and then afterwards it's gone. And in its place, they rebuilt this palace. And so now it's this major tourist site where people go and learn about Korean history at this place. And this happened, most buildings that the Japanese built, a lot of the buildings the Japanese built in this colonial period got torn down, especially Shinto shrines and other things that were like symbols of the military. A lot of those got torn down. And the ones that weren't torn down, they very much, the Koreans tend to treat them like they don't talk about their history. They don't talk about if the Japanese had built them or not. Oh, here again, here's the palace as it was relocated. And that the colonial building, only the spire is left, and it's preserved in this museum, this park behind a museum in another town. Now, Taiwan is an interesting comparison. Taiwan, there's just a lot less anger over the colonial period than there was in Korea. The Taiwanese were not nearly as nationalistic. Taiwan had suffered invasions by lots of different people, and so Korea was just another, the Japanese invasion was just another invasion. So you go to Taiwan, you see all these buildings that were built by the Japanese, and there's little signs saying, "Oh yes, it's built by the Japanese. Here's a building built by the Dutch. Here's a building built by the nationalist Chinese," and it's just another one of the periods they talked about. And so the government general building, the Japanese colonial capital, is now the Taiwan presidential office building. So it's it's still used, and people like it. It's a cool looking building. But in Korea, tear it down. Now, part of this is that just in Korea there was a lot more sense the Japanese had that, oh, we could bring them in. We can make them Japanese. We can assimilate them. They're similar enough to Japanese culture and language. Not as similar as the Okinawans, but they're similar enough that they could become Japanese. There was much less sense of the Taiwanese could become Japanese. And so they didn't actually put as much effort into it, even though in some ways they're more successful in Taiwan. But in Korea, they put a lot of effort into it. The first few years of rule in 1910 and 1919 were very brutal. I see the kanji mistake there. So if you recognize that kanji mistake, I apologize. Very, very brutal. There was groups that tried to, here. All right, I'm getting a lot of noise here. I'm sorry, but I'm gonna try we're almost done. So we'll try to get through it. All right, so in this early period of 1900, soon after it had been annexed, they're also, one of the big things they're doing is trying to spread Japanese culture, trying to make the Koreans into Japanese through education. The older generations, they're probably not gonna be able to get, but they figure the younger generations, teach them Japanese from first grade and treat them as if they are Japanese. And, it took a while. There was, one more time. Okay, it's gonna end this up really quick. Okay, they did schools, they did education. They didn't put a lot of money into it at first. They were doing it gradually, much slower than they did education in mainland Japan. But then the March 1st uprising happened, where a large number of people were calling for independence, and that scared the Japanese. And after that, they really pushed education much more. Public education. You see the numbers growing in the 1920s, 1930s. But still, even by 1945, only 40 to maybe 45% at the most of school-age children were going to Japanese language public schools. The time that from Japan first started doing public schools in the 1870s, by 1890, within about 20 years, they had 100% of children going to public schools. But in Korea, they didn't put quite as much effort into it. All right. In the later years, they became much more oppressive, especially for 1931, especially for 1937. Much more forcing them to go to Shinto shrines and worship. Okay, I'm gonna try it again. So in the wartime years, Korea got particularly abusive. The Japanese colonialism got particularly strong and abusive. Now, up to this point, they had taught both Japanese language and Korean language in the schools. But starting in 1937, they stopped teaching Korean and only taught Japanese language. Also, from 1940, they began the name-changing campaign, which strongly encouraged Koreans to change their names to Japanese names to fully take on the nature of being Japanese. Now, it's a little complicated. They still kept their Korean names, but they're supposed to take Japanese names as well. And it was not completely mandatory, but if you wanted to have a job, certainly anywhere in the government, if you wanted to go to a higher school, if you wanted your kids to go to some kind of higher school, if you, probably a lot of companies as well, required you to change your name. So there was a lot of pressure on people to change their names. In Taiwan, they had a similar program, but it was not nearly as compulsory as it was in Korea. Also in the 40s, this is when they began to encourage and then drafting Koreans to join the military. So moving them towards becoming full Japanese citizens. Now let's compare the situation of Okinawa to the situation of Korea. Okinawa gets taken over in 1872 completely. By 1911, you could say legally they're completely part of Japan. They have equality with other Japanese people. Now, there's still, of course, prejudice against Okinawans that continues after 1911. But legally, they received full Japanese citizenship. It took about 39 years. So again, they were annexed in 1872. In 1876, it became a prefecture, and legally, just like the rest of Japan in some ways. And they started having elementary schools, and including compulsory Japanese language education. By 1887, after about 10 years of that, they'd already reached 45%. Now, remember, in Korea, they don't reach 45% until, almost 40 years after they came in. So they're much quicker. And a big reason is that Okinawa is just a lot smaller. It's a smaller place. It's not as hard to build schools for all the Okinawans. It's just the population is much, much, much smaller than Korea. Now, there had been a lot of opposition to annexation, especially amongst the upper class Okinawans who were used to this relationship with China and who valued their independence. But by 1895, when Japan defeated the Chinese in the Sino-Japanese War, and these upper-class Okinawans had been hoping for China to come in basically and beat the Japanese and bring back their independence. But when the Chinese lost, most people said, "Oh, okay, we're not going to stop this. This is just going to happen. There's no fighting it." And opposition to the annexation began to weaken. By 1898, Okinawans became subject to military conscription, which, sounds bad, but again, this is seen as a step to be treated as a regular Japanese person for those people who wanted that. And then in 1911, they're given the right to vote in national elections and send representatives to the National Imperial Diet, just like people from Fukuoka or any other part of the country. So at this point, they have full, the laws of Japan all work in Okinawa, and they can send people to represent themselves in the Diet. Also in that year, school enrollment rates reached 98%, so nearly 100%. So from that point on, Okinawa was pretty much considered part of Japan. Now there are still people who didn't like it, but that number decreases more and more. And so in 1945, America takes away Okinawa, takes away from Japan, and rules it directly. And unlike the rest of Japan, which is just occupied by the Japanese military, by the American military, America takes Okinawa away from Japan, removes it from Japanese sovereignty, and keeps it that way until 1972. And there's some question what's going to happen. Is it going to become independent again? Is it going to become an American colony? But the Okinawan population overwhelmingly said, we want to be part of Japan. There's a lot of things we don't like about Japan. There's a lot of problems we have with Japan, but we want to be part of Japan. That's what we want. And so clearly, if you could say Okinawa was a colony, the population were determined to remain part of Japan. So you could say this is a successful example of integration. And so in 1972 they did, and again, there's still issues of discrimination certainly, but Okinawans almost universally consider themselves part of Japan. Korea, on the other hand, does not nearly go as far. In 1905 it becomes a dependent state. In 1910 it's annexed, and they start teaching Japanese language. By 1942, Koreans become subject to military conscription. But the enrollment rate in schools is much lower. And in 1944, in the middle of the war, desperation to get Koreans to help with the war, there's a promise that says, okay, by 1946, you will be voting in elections, just like the Okinawans. And you'll be full-fledged, Japanese citizens. The laws of Japan will extend to you as well, not these special laws made by the colonial government. So, of course, they didn't achieve that. The war ended before that. But that promise had been made. And again, by the end, they only reached 40%. So, much more difficult time, and partly because, Korea is just a much bigger place. All right, so your homework assignment is talk about what is the difference between the experience of Okinawa and Korea. Were they both colonies? Was Okinawa a colony? Is it still a colony today? So what's the difference between them? Maybe try to do a little more reading about the subject. So do a short about 500 words on that. But then your larger assignment is to write about any kind of colonial experience from your own country. Now remember, this is the broad meaning of the word colonialism. So it could be taking over another territory, but it also could mean any kind of inequality in the country, inequality for women, inequality for any kind of minority group, anything like that. What is a colonial experience? All countries have a colonial experience. And so you might have to think, you might have to imagine, what is a colonial? You might say, oh, we were a colony. Maybe, maybe you come from India or some other country that's colonized. You say, we were a colony. We were the ones that suffered. But use your imagination. Think about what are times when your country, some group in your country received unequal treatment from the majority, the powerful groups in the country. Now, if those people are still in your country, are they now completely integrated into the country? Can you imagine them becoming a head of the state? Can you imagine them becoming president or prime minister? Would that just be normal? Are there still any barriers that remain for those people? Or is it totally gone, totally forgotten? And be honest. Think about, to what degree does colonialism still exist in my society? So I'll write the details about that in the Moodle, about the number of words that are required and things like that. But that's your assignment for this week. All right. Again, I apologize for all the noise and all the pauses I had to do when the noise got really bad. All right. I hope you have a good day.